On the morning of November 8th, 1965, one of the most famous journalists in America was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse. She was propped up in bed in a bedroom she hadn't slept in for years, still in her wig, her makeup, her false eyelashes. A book opened in her lap, held upside down. A book she had reportedly already finished weeks before. Her name was Dorothy Kilgallen. At the time of her death, the public already knew what story she'd been chasing. Dorothy Kilgallen was investigating the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. She was the only reporter alive who'd been granted a private one-on-one interview with Jack Ruby, the man who silenced Lee Harvey Oswald before he could ever speak. And in the weeks before she died, she'd been telling people that she was close, that she was about to break the biggest scoop of the century. What most people didn't know was that Dorothy Kilgallen had already made powerful enemies. J. Edgar Hoover had a file on her. The FBI had come to this very same townhouse demanding to know her sources for classified transcripts she'd published, transcripts that the public was never supposed to see, from the Warren Commission, the official U.S. government body that had been established to investigate JFK's assassination. Transcripts that deeply embarrassed and distressed the United States government. Dorothy said she had found things that would blow the case wide open. She told her friends that if the wrong people knew what she knew, it would cost her her life. 9 months later, she was dead, and the files she had been meticulously building and protecting were nowhere to be found. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. Now what we are talking about today has grabbed and kept my attention for years, and I felt it was finally time to share it with all of you because I've learned some new things, and so I'm so excited to bring this to you today. There are some stories that don't just live in one moment, right? They stretch across decades. They thread themselves through history, politics, celebrity, power, crime, and myth until it becomes almost impossible to pull on one strand without disturbing the whole web. And Dorothy Kilgallen's story has captivated me for so long for exactly that reason. This is not just a moment in time thing. There were things that happened before. There were things that happened after. There's things that are still happening that really start to flesh everything out. It isn't just the story of a woman who died under strange circumstances or a journalist who believed she was getting close to the truth about what happened to President John F. Kennedy. This story travels through some of the most fascinating and shadowy corners of mid-century America. It touches JFK. I mean, it doesn't touch JFK. It heavily centers JFK. It brushes up against Marilyn Monroe. It moves through Fidel Castro's Cuba, the mafia, Hollywood, the nightclub world, and the glittering cafe society that made New York feel like the center of the universe. It pulls us into the underbelly of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, the CIA, Cold War paranoia, and a federal government that, at the time, often seemed to operate with the belief that if something was done in the name of national security, then almost anything could be justified. And I say at the time to be kind of tongue-in-cheek because we know that's what they still do. And that is what makes this era so compelling and so unsettling, because it never really stopped. And during this time, it was just hidden better. On the surface, America looked dazzling. It was cocktails and supper clubs, movie stars and gossip columns, penthouses, presidential charisma, mink coats, flash bulbs, all of it polished until it sparkled. But underneath that shine, there was something much darker moving beneath the floorboards. Surveillance, blackmail, organized crime, political secrets, intelligence operations. That contrast is what pulls me in. The glamour and the rot, the champagne and the cover-ups, the famous faces smiling for photographs, while behind the scenes alliances were being made, secrets were being buried, and people who got too close to certain truths sometimes found themselves destroyed, or, in Dorothy Kilgallen's case, erased completely. Dorothy Kilgallen lived right at the center of that world, that glittering Hollywood, New York high society world, and she found herself at the intersection of all of these different threads. She was also an incredibly interesting person who lived an incredibly interesting life. And even though I believe she recognized the impact of what she had discovered, and she seemed to realize she was potentially in danger, I don't think she even could have ever fully comprehended that the depth of what she had begun to uncover and what would happen and all the dominoes that would fall after, which have caused, ripples and echoes even to this day. I don't think that Dorothy understood just how depraved, how powerful, and how desperate some people might be when faced with the possibility of exposure. I don't think she realized the lengths that certain men would go in order to protect themselves, their secrets, their institutions, and the version of America they had so carefully constructed for public consumption. We understand that now, right? We are in a world where there's still this exterior of glitz and glamour and kind of distraction, but we have seen underneath it and we can't unsee it. Dorothy lived in that glittering world. She was born into it. It's where she spent her life. It's where her career was. But she also knew about the darkness that existed beneath all of it. Of course she did. She spent her career listening at keyholes and reading between the lines, but I don't think she understood how deep that darkness went. I don't think she fully realized that beneath the glamour was not just gossip, scandal, and run-of-the-mill corruption, but an alternate world operating by its own rules, where power protected power, where truth was treated as a threat, and where the people who got too close could find themselves in very real and actual danger. Not the danger of losing your career, not the danger of having your reputation smeared, or the danger of losing some money, but the danger of losing your life and having your work that you were about ready to expose to the world vanish. So it was all for nothing. We have a lot to talk about today, but before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Quince. I want to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, Quince, which is honestly such a good place to go when you want those elevated, high-quality essentials without feeling like you just financially ruined your entire week or month. And what I really like about Quince is that they're not trying to be a dupe brand. The focus is quality first, premium materials, timeless designs, and pieces that are actually made to last. They have everything from 100% grade A Mongolian cashmere and buttery soft bamboo bedding to 14-karat gold jewelry, Italian leather bags, home goods, cast iron Dutch ovens, which is awesome. Basically all the things that make you feel like you have your life together, even if you absolutely do not. So Quince did send me a few pieces. And of course, because you know me, I got almost everything in green, besides the black Mongolian cashmere cropped crew cardigan, because everyone needs a good quality black cardigan in their closet. It's a staple piece. And this cardigan is probably one of my favorites because it feels so luxe, but it's still really wearable. It's not one of those pieces where you put it on and feel like you have to stand perfectly still and not touch anything. It's not giving you any weird rashes because I have sensitive skin. It's soft, it's cozy, it's flattering, and it makes this simple outfit look more intentional. You can dress it up, you can dress it down, and it's really comfortable on the skin, like I said, which is important to me. So ridiculously soft, and I have no issue pairing it with anything. I also got what I'm wearing right now, which is the flow knit wide leg pants. These pants are dangerous in the best way because they feel like lounge pants, so I can sit here and, film a video for 4 hours and not be uncomfortable, but they don't look like you're wearing lounge pants or sweatpants. They're the kind of pants I would wear working from home, filming, traveling anywhere. I want to be comfortable but still look pulled together, and that's what I think is the best part. I don't feel sloppy. If I have to run some errands before going to work for the day, like go to a lawyer's office or stop at the store, I look like I care about my appearance to the outside world, but I'm still going to be comfortable enough to sit at my computer for 7 hours. And I just absolutely love this color of green. It is so beautiful and kind of different than anything I've ever seen, which is why I got the matching ultra soft slim fit hooded jacket. And it's another really easy staple. It's soft, it's fitted without being restrictive, and it layers really nicely. So I have a white tank top on underneath so I can kind of zip it all the way up. There's a hood, right? So if it starts raining, just like that. The pants and the jacket look really perfect together. Obviously, they are meant to go together, I believe, because they look perfect together and I feel comfortable, but I don't look too comfortable. And I will say, Right now, I'm just absolutely in love with the Bianca stretch satin dress. It's a showstopper. From the beautiful deep green color to the sleek elevated satin look, it's got this like really high end, like you're going to a very nice event, but it's got stretch to it. So it looks beautiful on, it looks sophisticated, but it's also so easy to wear because of that stretch, which I appreciate deeply as a person who likes to breathe, sit down, and eat food. Quince is able to offer these kinds of pieces at really good prices because they work directly with top tier manufacturers and they cut out the middlemen. So you're getting exceptional quality without that traditional markup. They also only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices, which makes me feel better about what I'm buying and wearing. And Quince is one of those places where I can really rack up the items in my cart, knowing the pieces will be beautiful, knowing the fabric quality will be top notch, and knowing I'm not going to get sticker shock and have to start deleting things when I hit view cart, because we've all been there and done that. So if you want to upgrade your wardrobe, your home, or just add a few really beautiful essentials into your life, check out Quince using my link. You can find the pieces I mentioned and so much more at Quince. Check out the link in the description box below. Thank you so much to Quince for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. So there's a lot of books that have been written about Dorothy Kilgallen, and I've read pretty much all of them. So you have your kind of quintessential The Reporter Who Knew Too Much by Mark Shaw, Collateral Damage also by Mark Shaw, which kind of goes deeper into Dorothy and JFK and Marilyn Monroe. You have Kilgallen, which was written in 1979 by Lee Israel, and I also read that. It was very hard to find. And there's just a bunch of books written about her, and you kind of have to figure out what's true, what's just supposition. And at the end of the day, like when people talk about Dorothy Kilgallen and she was a reporter and she was looking into what happened to JFK and she knew too much. And so she ended up dying and her death was kind of covered up. So you hear that and it's kind of this like quick footnote, but I don't think people actually realize how famous and how high profile Dorothy Kilgallen was. Like she was one of the most recognizable figures in her time. And there's a good reason for that. And like I said, she lived a very, very interesting life. Her career trajectory was insane. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about how all of that's important and relevant into where she would end up going, what she would end up discovering, and what would end up happening to her. Dorothy May Kilgallen was born on July 3rd, 1913 in Chicago to her parents Jim and May Kilgallen. Now, Dorothy's father Jim would be a news reporter for over 75 years, retiring just before his death in 1982. Jim was known as the Dean of American Journalism, so also pretty high profile. And Jim Kilgallen was a force to be reckoned with and an obvious influence to his daughter, who would eventually follow in his footsteps and some would argue eclipse him as far as careers go. So Dorothy's mother, May, was reportedly an opera singer at one point until she walked away from that career to devote herself fully to being a wife and mother. Apparently, she was just absolutely head over heels for Jim Kilgallen. She wanted nothing other than to be his wife once she met him and they were married. We know that Dorothy's mother, May, was a devoted, hardcore Catholic who her husband, Jim, once described as a stunning redhead who stood at 5 feet 2 inches and could have married into money if she wasn't brave enough to settle for something else. So in 1914, when Dorothy was only an infant, the family moved to Laramie, Wyoming, where May had family, and Jim bought the Laramie Boomerang, a local paper founded in 1888, which still exists today. And even at that young age, Dorothy was known to be in the offices of the paper, and her father said he would sit her in the window of the Boomerang where the people passing by could see her banging her baby fists on the keys of a typewriter. The Kilgallens only stayed in Laramie for 2 years before moving again to Indiana, where Jim worked as the managing editor of the Indiana Times, and this is also where Dorothy's little sister Eleanor would be born in 1919. And Eleanor would also hold her own next to her father, who would become very well known, and her sister, who would also become very well known. Eleanor would actually go on to be one of the most influential talent executives in Hollywood, with a star-studded roster that includes names like Robert Redford, Harrison Ford, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Warren Beatty. So this really goes back to who are these people? Where did they come from? How did kind of two daughters of, yes, somebody who would eventually become a, infamous reporter in his own right, but how did they go to lead such illustrious careers, especially in a time when it wasn't really easy for women to do that? And I think I know why, and I think that there's something behind it, but we will come back to that. So once again, the family's time in Indiana was short-lived because Jim ended up getting them kicked out, basically. He wrote an expose about some local jails, and he was like, these jails suck. They are so old, they're not secure. He said that a prisoner could escape by simply smashing the walls with their fists, and then 4 prisoners actually tried it. So Jim got in trouble. He was sentenced to 28 days in jail for contempt of court, where he apparently found out that you couldn't escape by smashing the walls with your fists, or I don't think he would have been there for 28 days. And when he got out of jail, he grabbed his wife and daughters. They went back to Chicago, where he would get his first major break, starting to work for the International News Service. This was a national news wire service founded by William Randolph Hearst in 1909 to serve his growing newspaper empire and to compete with other major wire services like the Associated Press. So this is where Jim Kilgallen became legendary due to the sheer sweep of history that he witnessed and covered firsthand. In 1920, the same year he started at the wire service, Jim was one of the first to cover the explosive news that members of the Chicago White Sox had conspired with gamblers to intentionally lose the 1919 World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. Like, they threw the World Series. It was a big scandal. It was called the Black Sox scandal. So in 1925, when a young Tennessee teacher named John T. Scopes went on trial for teaching evolution in a public school classroom, Jim Kilgallen was there covering every detail. He also covered the executions of Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray in 1928, which I have a full video about if you're interested in it. It's a very cool kind of vintage case, but Ruth Snyder was the first woman who was executed at Sing Sing since 1899, which made the case stand out on its own. But what made the event and the case itself truly legendary was what happened inside the death chamber. A photographer named Tom Howard, working with the New York Daily News, secretly smuggled a small camera into the execution chamber by strapping it to his ankle. Obviously, cameras were banned in the execution chamber, but Howard managed to get a picture, and he exposed one image at the moment that the electricity was passing through Ruth Snyder's body. And so that photo ran on the front page of the Daily News under a huge headline that said "dead," and it became what is widely described as the first known photograph of an execution by electric chair. And it was like very shocking at the time, obviously. So Jim Kilgallen was reporting when American pilot Charles Lindbergh became the first person to fly nonstop across the Atlantic in 1927. Jim was also reporting 5 years later when that very same pilot made headlines again in March of 1932 when his infant son was kidnapped from his family's New Jersey home, the Lindbergh baby. So on May 12, 1932, about 10 weeks after the kidnapping, the child's body was found in the woods a few miles from the Lindbergh home. The FBI says the body was discovered partly buried and badly decomposed, and the coroner concluded the child had likely been dead for about 2 months, with the death caused by a blow to the head. So the investigation eventually led to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German-born carpenter living in the Bronx. He was arrested in 1934 after ransom money was traced to him. So Jim Kilgallen is covering all of this. He's like, Charles Lindbergh's son is being kidnapped. This is a big deal. There are things, once again, having to do with Charles Lindbergh and the CIA that are interesting and tie into everything, but we'll put a pin in it because that's not the main avenue of the story we're going on. But Jim Kilgallen was on every major news story. He was present at every major trial, and he interviewed multiple high-profile figures like Al Capone, which will be important, Henry Ford, Winston Churchill, and even Thomas Edison, who was really old at the time that Jim Kilgallen interviewed him. And Dorothy was close to her father, Jim, obviously, but it was clear also that she admired him and appreciated that he wasn't like the fathers of her friends and peers. Dorothy once said about her father, quote, "When I was a very small girl, he fascinated me with tales of murder trials, Ku Klux Klan meetings, trapped coal miners, and rioting strikers," end quote. So Jim Kilgallen was out there living an exciting life, getting held at gunpoint on a train, following fugitives halfway around the world, excitedly jotting down all the lurid details from his courtroom seat during dramatic murder trials, and then mesmerizing his daughter with his tales and his adventures. Dorothy said, quote, "Other girls on our block had fathers who made more money than mine, but they worked in offices and stores. My father was always tossing things into a suitcase and taking a train or a plane to someplace where a story was breaking." End quote. Dorothy's mother, May, had hopes that her daughter would become an English teacher, a nice and safe position for a young woman at this time, but Dorothy apparently had bigger dreams that extended beyond 3 months off for vacation every summer. And teachers don't come for me. I'm just using her words. I just didn't want to say quote again, but that's what she said. I'm not saying that being a teacher isn't, enough or it's not a big aspiration. And I will say that having 3 months of vacation every summer is amazing. So I was just telling you what Dorothy said. So when Dorothy was 11, she and her family were living in Brooklyn, and she was telling her friends as they sat on her front stoop that someday she would be famous and they would all be reading about her. Now, during high school, Dorothy got good grades in English, but not so good grades in math. I can relate, despite her reported 140 IQ, which I don't think I can relate to that. I don't think I have 140 IQ. That's pretty high, right? So she was on the school paper. She graduated in 1930 before starting at New Rochelle College at the age of 17, and Dorothy only went to college for 1 year. She dropped out in 1931 after being offered a job at the New York Evening Journal, where she would be paid $20 a week. So also understand, this woman, Dorothy Kilgallen, she's going to go on to be not just an amazing journalist and good at being a journalist, but she's brilliant. She's a brilliant person. She's very smart. She's very sharp. College dropout. She only went for 1 year. And according to, the headmistress or whatever they called him at the time, because I think it was an all-girls school, she really never was kind of with it when she was there for that 1 year. She was just kind of in and out. She was always looking for a way out. She didn't want to go to college. Now, the Evening Journal, also part of William Randolph Hearst's empire, was one of Hearst's first New York papers and the undisputed flagship of what we know as yellow journalism. So that's how Ruth Snyder's picture ends up on the front page of newspapers with the headline "Dead" and this horrendous picture of a woman who is having electricity run through her is going on the front page of newspapers, and people are just absolutely shocked because they hadn't seen anything like that before. And that's what yellow journalism basically is, right? News written and reported not just to inform, but to sell, to shock, to dominate the conversation, to keep upping the ante. I know we showed you Ruth Snyder getting electrocuted, and you were all shocked by that. And now we have to do something more shocking. We have to do something more extreme. We got to keep people coming back for that quick novelty dopamine of seeing something horrendous or scandalous on the front page of the paper. So the Journal was a daily afternoon paper intended to grab the attention of working class New Yorkers who were rushing to get home and catch the train or the subway. And they were all about that hook, the hyperdramatic front page coverage of murder trials, high society divorces, celebrity gossip. Global politics were not a concern for the Journal unless they were salacious, like a Fidel Castro, for instance. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Journal really wasn't concerned with politics as a whole, though. They wanted to raise eyebrows with the sordid details of some love triangle murder scandal, and the people of New York were happy to oblige, right? Because they wanted a distraction from how much life sucked anyways. So 18-year-old Dorothy, she's 18 when she gets this job at the Evening Journal. She started out there as a cub reporter. A cub, like a bear cub, basically meant she was a rookie with little to no experience. And it was true. Dorothy was young. She had no technical experience as a reporter. We know Dorothy had grown up in this world, though, with her father, listening to him. He was a reporter. But Dorothy had something else that made her stand out from her peers, and even, I would say, made her stand out from her father, Jim Kilgallen. She had an almost magical power that would follow her throughout her life and become her absolute trademark. Dorothy possessed a legendary, uncanny ability to get people to talk to her when they wouldn't talk to anyone else. She knew what to do and what to say to get people to put their guards down, come out of their shells, whether she was talking to the target of a story she was chasing, like the suspect or the person who was, on trial or being charged, or even a rival reporter who she would somehow rope into helping her gain access or secure information. To other people, Dorothy looked very straightforward, right? She looked like a petite, impeccably dressed, soft-spoken young woman. She loved fashion, so she was always very fancily dressed, and her outfits were put together and color coordinated, and she always had like little matching bags. So, especially during this time, people are going to look at a woman like that and be like, oh, look at her. She's so cute. They're going to assume that she's harmless, especially when they're comparing her to, the other reporters, like these aggressive cigar chomping men who are like really kind of just doing normal techniques to try and get a story, just being aggressive and like yelling at people, like answer the questions as they're walking into the courthouse. Dorothy didn't do that. So James Horan, who worked at the Journal with Dorothy, said, quote, she's young, she's fresh looking, she must have spent a fortune on clothes because she had the appearance of having just stepped out of the traditional bandbox, no smell of tobacco, just perfume. There were a great many young girls in and about that city room. You'd see them one week and that would be it. But there was something about the way Dorothy handled herself. I had the opinion that she was born for business. That soft, quiet way of hers hid a steely ambition and a drive, and also a very keen intelligence, end quote. So women in journalism had long been pushed into a particular box or a particular corner of journalism. They were often called sob sisters, and this was sort of a patronizing label for female reporters who were expected to bring the tears, the emotion, the human angle. So it's like, yeah, you can report on stuff, but nothing real. Go talk about how Grandma Ethel lost her cat in a tree, and we'll do like a human interest piece. You don't have the ability, or we don't trust you enough to cover anything real because you'll be too emotional about it. Now, Dorothy allowed people to underestimate her, to think that she was a sob sister, that she would just write a puff piece or not focus on getting the hard-hitting details, but they would be very wrong in thinking that. Dorothy was sharp-minded, relentless. She took every story and found her way in. While veteran reporters clustered together trying to be the first to get official press releases or interviews with law enforcement, Dorothy would track down suspects or pay visits to the families of victims at their homes. She would sit on front porches for hours. She would speak softly. She would offer empathy and a listening ear. And people would inevitably open up to her and tell her things that they would never have considered sharing with another reporter. Or if you were a reporter, something you would never consider sharing with your competition. Damon Runyon was one of those larger-than-life newspapermen at this time in New York who seemed to belong equally to the newsroom, the boxing ring, the racetrack, and the back table of a Broadway nightclub. He wrote about gamblers, gangsters, showgirls, bookies, and hustlers with such style that his name would become shorthand for an entire world of fast talk, funny nicknames, and men in expensive suits who always seemed to know a guy who knew a guy. Damon Runyon was a very interesting reporter, and he worked for the New York American, and he had his own way of getting stories, but even he fell victim to Dorothy's unassuming doe-in-the-woods act. Quote, she had soft, dark hair and huge, appealing blue eyes that gaze at you with an expression of infinite innocence buried in their azure depths. She looked so young and helpless that you say to yourself, my goodness, I must assist this poor little child in her work. I must shield her from the rough edges of life. That is, you say this to yourself if you are a man out on an assignment against Miss Kilgallen and unacquainted with her. Maybe you disregard her as an unlikely opposition in your pursuit of news and turn your watchfulness to the hard-eyed members of the sterner sex, and you are positively shocked when you pick up the journal the next day and discover that the little girl with the eyes of a gazelle has scooped your head off. End quote. Even as a rookie reporter, Dorothy proved herself to be more than capable, and she was thrown straight into the competitive and sensationalist fire of New York papers, doing anything they could to gain and secure their readership. She beat out veteran reporters by securing exclusive interviews with witnesses. She was able to get details that no one else could, and like her father, she found herself sitting in the courtroom of almost every major trial that was happening, including the trial of Bruno Hauptmann, who, remember, was accused of kidnapping the Lindbergh baby. In September of 1936, 3 rival New York papers decided to put on a competition. So they would each contribute 1 reporter to the competition, and then basically the competition was which of these reporters could get around the globe the fastest using transportation that would be available to any regular traveler, right? Planes, trains, buses, etc. Now, the goal was obviously to boost paper sales, but also they wanted to prove that commercial aviation, commercial flight, had made the world smaller. A normal person flying on a plane to go somewhere for work or vacation, this was actually still a pretty novel concept in 1936. And airlines were financially struggling because the average person still saw flying as new and slightly dangerous, and flying was, still kind of expensive. Well, I mean, it's probably way more expensive now. Actually, it is ridiculously expensive now to fly anywhere, and I don't always remember it being like that. So it started off expensive. There was a time where it became affordable, I guess, and then it's just back to being absolutely unaffordable. So the Evening News Journal, actually selected Dorothy Kilgallen as their reporter. The World Telegram chose Herbert Ekins, and the third person was Leo Kieran of the New York Times. Now, although Ekins and Kieran had weeks to plan their routes and get their travel documents and get ready, Dorothy was a last-minute decision for some reason, and she only had 24 hours notice to get a passport, secure 16 international visas, and pack a single suitcase. Which, let's be fair, today, that would be absolutely impossible. You couldn't get 1 passport and half a visa in 24 hours. On September 30th, 1936, the clock officially started, and Dorothy's incredible journey around the world would capture her readers' imaginations as she cabled daily chatty updates back to New York City. So she started in New Jersey, where she boarded the infamous Hindenburg, the massive German airship that would tragically burst into flames like 8 months later after she boarded it. Dorothy's first update back to New York was in her normal tone, cheeky and confident, quote, "I'm off to race around the world, a race against time and 2 men. I know I can beat time. I hope I can beat the men," end quote. So the Hindenburg got Dorothy across the Atlantic to Frankfurt, Germany, and from there she flew through Italy, Iraq, and Bangkok with plenty of adventure and misadventure along the way. She flew on Pan Am's famous China Clipper across the Pacific. She stopped in Guam, Honolulu, Manila. She got stranded by a typhoon in Manila. And at the end of the race around the world, Dorothy came in second place, completing her trip in 24 days, 12 hours, and 51 minutes. Now, Bud Ekins won the race in just over 18 days, but it is worth noting that he definitely should have been disqualified because he definitely cheated. He broke the rules when he chartered a private plane for one leg of his journey. So, boo, Bud. But anyways, when Dorothy returned to New York, she was still happy about her progress, right? She was happy about what she had achieved. And she wrote her final thoughts saying, quote, "The world is grand, awfully big, and astonishingly beautiful, frequently thrilling, but I love New York," end quote. Despite coming in second, Dorothy Kilgallen did become the first woman to fly around the world on commercial airlines, and this sort of made her famous. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote her a letter to congratulate Dorothy. She was honored during an official ceremony at City Hall. Every house on her block was featuring her picture and an American flag for like weeks after she got home, and Dorothy seized on this opportunity to use the notoriety and fame and turn it into lasting influence. So now that her name was known by so many, she wanted to be sure they never forgot it. In November of 1936, Dorothy traveled to Los Angeles, California, where she delivered a screenplay to Warner Brothers based on her trip around the world that would be turned into a movie called Fly Away, Baby. She also wrote a book, by the way, which I would love to get my hands on, and I cannot find it anywhere. Like, I can see it. Certain libraries have it. Cornell University is the closest library to me that has it, but I can't find it. Like, even if I wanted to pay a lot of money for it, I can't find it. It's called Girl Around the World. So if anybody knows where I can get it, please let me know. So Dorothy was also in LA with a mission from the Journal, right? Because she still has to be a reporter and a journalist and do her job. And the Journal said, go to Hollywood and discover and write about the real Hollywood, okay? Not like what everyone sees, like get all the gossip, get all the dirt. But when a 23-year-old Dorothy first arrived on the West Coast, she found that just being a standard journalist wouldn't really get her anywhere. It only kind of got her studio-approved press releases or like what they wanted her to see. The powerful studio publicity machines completely blocked outsiders from seeing behind the curtain. So realizing that she couldn't get the real story as a famous New York reporter, she decided to go completely undercover. Dorothy packed away her stylish New York wardrobe, she stripped off her makeup, and she put on plain, ordinary clothes. She created Mary Warren, a naive, wide-eyed girl from Peoria, Illinois, who just hopped off a bus with nothing but a suitcase and a dream of becoming a movie star. And then Dorothy went on to live entirely as Mary Warren. She spent weeks navigating the lowest rungs of the Hollywood ladder to experience exactly what happened to thousands of young women arriving in LA every year. She stood in grueling cattle call audition lines, flooded casting offices, flooded with people, not water. She sat in crowded waiting rooms, and she experienced firsthand the callous rejection and casual exploitation of the Hollywood studio system. She stayed in cheap, rundown boarding houses alongside real-life struggling starlets, eating meager meals and learning about the financial desperation that plagued these background actors and extras and people who were trying to get their big break. So after gathering her material, Kilgallen returned to New York and published an explosive multi-part expose titled The Real Hollywood. And the series was a massive sensation. Instead of the glitz and glamour fairy tale usually fed to the public, Dorothy wrote with biting honesty about the heartbreak, the poverty, the systemic cruelty that chewed up young girls from small towns who arrived in Los Angeles thinking it was the land of opportunity. And she basically told girls, hey, Hollywood isn't what it was 10 years ago, where you can come here with nothing and become the next big thing or the next Marilyn Monroe. You're better off staying in Illinois. There's nothing good for you here, right? And Illinois is just supposed to be stay wherever you are. Maybe get a different dream because it's bad out here. It's bad in these streets, as Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, would attest to. So Dorothy did not make a lot of friends in Los Angeles, to say the least. She made her distaste for the city and the industry very clear. She said it could never hold a candle to New York, which she returned to as soon as she could. When she got back to New York, she found that her LA columns had done well. They'd been well received. People liked her refreshing take. They liked the way she had fearlessly stripped away the glittering facade of Hollywood and exposed the darker truth with a biting wit and a sarcastic humor that kept readers enthralled. And it happened to have been the perfect moment in history to write about the same sort of topics in the Big Apple. This was a time when things were changing. The dynamics of who controlled social currency in New York had shifted pretty dramatically after World War I. So we all know the older Gilded Age version of New York society, right? The Astors and all the old money, the people who, kind of had been in New York since the beginning. A lot of them came from Dutch families. And we know that who was accepted into society and who was considered to be important had been tightly controlled by family name, lineage, private clubs, and the social register, which was an actual printed directory of who was an acceptable part of high society. The social register isn't just some, oh yeah, it's who we think. No, it was a printed, if your name was on it, you were good. And if it wasn't, you were nothing. It didn't matter how much money someone had. If you weren't from a prominent old money family and you've never seen the inside of Carolyn Astor's ballroom, you weren't shit, right? However, like I said, the world was changing. This traditional version of high society, the Astors and the Vanderbilts and all of that, they were very private. They were all about discretion and closed doors and nobody's going to see our drama. Nobody's going to see our shame. Nobody's going to see if we're having trouble with our wives or our husbands or our families, or if our daughter's being shipped away to a mental institution. Nobody will ever know, right? Or if our daughter's being shipped away because she got pregnant and she's going to have a baby and then come back and act like it never happened. That was very old money New York. But with the rise of newspapers and the readers wanting, I guess I could say wanting something more authentic, but really what they wanted was gossip. They wanted a view of the inside. A lot of these people were wanting to see, okay, you're living the high life, you have a ton of money, but only a few people, your friends, get to see that and experience it. We want to see it and we want to experience it. So because of this, because of the public desire for gossip and tea and dirt and an insider look, a newer social order started to emerge called cafe society. And the figures that existed there were very embarrassing to the old money people because they were looser, they were flashier. And you could be old money and be in cafe society, but you could also be new money. You could be from Hollywood. You could be European aristocracy, a famous writer, a fashion designer, a beautiful divorcee, a gossip columnist, or someone attached to power in some way, because the key was proximity. Proximity to wealth, fame, scandal, beauty, publicity. Cafe society was the social media world before social media. It was like influencers before, smartphones even existed. It was a network of people whose power came from being photographed at the right places with the right people, written about, invited, seated at the right table, connected to the people that in their periphery would also kind of give them fame and notoriety. It was also very much a gossip economy. So a person's social value could rise or fall depending on who invited them, who they were photographed with, who they were married to, who they got divorced from, what table they got at El Morocco, whether they appeared in a gossip column, whether they were even considered amusing, elegant, rich, dangerous, beautiful, useful. It was very transactional. And writers like Dorothy Kilgallen were not just observers, they were part of that machinery. They could make someone seem glamorous, ridiculous, suspicious, or desirable, which gave them their own social clout and pull, right? Because if you are somebody who is in cafe society or wants to be kind of noticed, you're going to want to make sure that the journalists and the columnists are saying the right things that are going to make people interested in you. So you're going to want to cozy up to those journalists and columnists. In 1938, Dorothy launched her column, her very own column, The Voice of Broadway, where she wrote about theater, nightlife, celebrities, who was seen where, opening nights, romances, feuds, general entertainment world, gossip, and news. And Dorothy was witty. She was observant. She was also known to sometimes have a sharp tongue, and she wasn't afraid to be pointed or even catty at times. The Voice of Broadway would grow into one of the most widely read syndicated columns in the country, eventually running in more than 140 papers and reaching a readership of millions daily. Dorothy would do this column for, decades. It was so popular. It was like every day people were like, okay, we got to open the paper. And this was whatever paper. It wasn't just in New York papers anymore. It's syndicated. So it's appearing in 140 papers around the country. I would read interviews with people, and they were like, yeah, every morning my wife and I would know, okay, let's wake up, let's have our coffee, and then we have to see what Dorothy has to say. And this gave Dorothy power and influence because a Broadway show could succeed or fail based on what Dorothy had to say about it. She made a lot of friends, obviously, because a person's high-profile marriage could either be kept private if you're friends with Dorothy or splashed all over the paper for everyone to see. Dorothy made a lot of friends, right? So this allowed Dorothy to be genuinely plugged in into the worlds of Hollywood, Broadway, and New York high society. And it made readers feel like they were getting real insider information, which they were. And I will be fair, Dorothy would rarely kind of hold back a story because someone was a friend. She would kind of soften the blow. But if you were her friend and then suddenly you weren't, she would destroy you like she did to Frank Sinatra, just decimated him. So this same year that Dorothy started her column, there was a man named Richard Colmer who was a rising young Broadway actor and singer, and he was in the cast of a musical called Knickerbocker Holiday, which opened in the fall of 1938. So Dorothy thought that Colmer was handsome. She was impressed by his talent. She wrote about this in her column, and this caused Richard Colmer's press agent to formally introduce Richard and Dorothy to each other. Because Dorothy's writing all these nice things, Richard Colmer's like, this girl's nice to me. I want to meet her. So they did. So Richard Colmer was widely considered to be handsome. He was stylish. He was dashing. He also liked to dress in fancy clothes. He liked a good wardrobe. He also was a good singer with a deep baritone voice and a family lineage that impressed Dorothy. Richard Colmer's great-grandfather was Daniel D. Tompkins, who'd served 5 consecutive terms as the governor of New York and then also served 2 terms as vice president under President Monroe. Now, as we'll come to find out, both Dorothy and Richard were known for having extravagant ways. They liked to, spend money. They liked the finer things in life, but neither of them was especially good at saving or managing money. Dorothy would become really good at making money. Richard Colmer, not so much, but neither of them was really good at making sure they had money for like the future or for, in the case that something happened. Now, for their first date, they had lunch together, and Richard Colmer, he didn't have any money at that time, really. He was in a Broadway play. Like, he had something, but not, he's not like rolling in it. He actually hired someone to drive him to the date in his black Cadillac, which he'd bought used, so he would look more important than he actually was. But apparently, he and Dorothy hit it off, and by their sixth date, Richard had proposed, and she'd accepted. Yes, only 6 dates in. Too soon. So the couple got married on April 6th, 1940, in front of 800 guests, obviously star-studded. They had their wedding reception at the St. Regis and honeymooned in Hawaii. Now, you will hear, I believe it was in Lee Israel's book that was written in the 1970s, that Richard Colmer and Dorothy honeymooned in Cuba. That is not true. It was Hawaii. So they had 3 children together. Their first child was a son named Richard Jr., born in July of 1941. Their daughter Jill was born in 1943, and their son Carrie was born in March of 1954. Now, from what I can tell, and from what is available, and from what I know about people, the relationship was complicated. And it seems that it was complicated for the same reason most relationships are, but also it was complicated for reasons that didn't need to be complicated. Before even meeting, both people have their own pasts, right? Their own family dynamics in which they're raised, expectations for the future, for what a relationship is going to look like. And reportedly, Richard and Dorothy had a lot of physical chemistry. They were very affectionate with each other. And as the years passed and they intertwined their lives even more, they did seem to develop a genuine friendship, or at least business partnership. However, very much like Dorothy went to go report on The Real Hollywood and see underneath the glitz and glamour, Dorothy kind of presented in her marriage with Richard a kind of glitz and glamour front. Like, she never wanted to see her looking less than her best. She kept a separate dressing room so that at night she would take off her makeup from the day and then reapply a lighter layer of makeup before getting in bed with her husband. And Dorothy once told a reporter that they never fought. Not because there weren't reasons to, because there were. Between Richard and Dorothy, there were. But Dorothy said she never fought because she thought it was selfish. She said, quote, "We don't fight, but we do have quiet periods. Most people I know that fight are purely selfish. If they'd only hold their tongue about small issues, 24 hours later, they'd forget about them and everything would be all right." End quote. Well, anyone who knows anything about being in a, safe and open relationship where there's intimacy and where you want to reduce the chance of resentment building up, they would know that this kind of approach is a recipe for disaster. It's avoidant. It's kind of like, if I don't say anything, then nothing bad will happen. But apparently Dorothy had been raised this way, to be a bit avoidant, to not confront issues with the hope they would go away, to avoid dealing with emotions, especially anger, to kind of avoid dealing with any negative emotions. She had watched her own mother, May, not question her husband, Jim, when he came home late from work or didn't contact her for weeks on end while he was out following a lead or doing something else. And a close friend of Dorothy's, Jean Bach, said that this had been May's message to her daughter Dorothy. Quote, "It's the thing of suffering in silence, of not confronting. That made you a superior person." End quote. Basically like, I'm not going to get emotional. I'm not going to be the person who says something and causes issues here. I'm going to be like the calm one. I'm going to be superior in that way, but it's also avoidant to just avoid confrontation. So Richard Colmer would go on to act. He would produce on Broadway, host radios and television programs. He tried his hand at restaurants, supper clubs, art galleries. He was doing a bunch of stuff, okay? He wasn't without talent or ambition, and he did have some successes, but his career was uneven. He really didn't make the best choices. His business instincts were not especially sharp. It kind of seemed like he did things because he wanted attention or he wanted people to think he was, doing well when in reality he wasn't. So it was like, if I open like a glamorous like restaurant, then everybody will be like, oh, look, it's Richard Colmer and he owns this glamorous restaurant and he's cool. He cared very much what people thought about him. So he kind of made stupid decisions to achieve these things that he thought looked good. And in their marriage, Dorothy was increasingly the more famous, more powerful, and more consistently successful half of the couple. And this may have caused some feelings of inadequacy in Richard. It may have made him feel like he had to receive validation in other ways and from other sources. And it appears that from pretty early on in the marriage, like pretty early on, like the first year, Richard Colmer retreated into heavy alcohol use and compulsive and chronic infidelity. His many affairs and trysts were not unknown to Dorothy. But remember, she's going to hold her tongue. She's not going to talk about it. She's not going to argue. That's selfish. She reportedly did try to make the marriage better. She tried to cater to him and offer him more of herself, thinking that he was stepping out because she was lacking in some way, or she worked too much and she wasn't there enough. So she'd bring him on like long vacations where it was just the two of them and they could reconnect. For over a decade, she did remain faithful and committed to making the marriage work. Now, it is likely, and I think true, that instead of calling out Richard's infidelity, Dorothy just stayed quiet, as she stated in that interview, hoping that everything would be all right, hoping that maybe if he saw she loved him and wasn't raking him across the coals for every mistake, he'd realized that he'd had all he needed in her, but Richard didn't stop, and everything was not all right. And you might be like, why are you talking about this, Stephanie? Trust me, I'm not talking about anything that's not relevant. Because remember, Dorothy is found dead in her townhouse in a room she hadn't slept in years. And this is the reason she hadn't slept in that room in years, because that was the room she had slept in with her husband when they shared a marital bed before she realized he was a serial cheater. And she would refuse to even go in that room because of what it represented to her and what it meant to her. So all this being said, if you looked at this couple from the outside, you would have no idea that their bond and intimacy was disintegrating by the day, because they were, at their core, show people, right? Broadway, put on a show, the show must go on. So on April 15th, 1945, Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick premiered. And this was a daily radio show broadcast from the dining room table of Dorothy and Richard's home. And it was simply Dorothy and Richard chatting with each other as they ate breakfast. So now Dorothy's got a column every day. She's got like a radio show she's doing every day, because this show ran Monday through Friday, reaching an estimated 20 million listeners from 1945 until 1963. Okay, this is like a long time after the marriage is over. They haven't shared a bedroom. And they're keeping it going because there's money there, right? There's sponsors. There's money to be made from Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick. So the subject matter would vary from day to day. Sometimes Dorothy and Richard would talk about the Broadway scene, their glamorous life in New York, what restaurants they were going to, what they wore, who they saw, what the people they saw were wearing. Sometimes they would talk about their family, the joys and challenges of parenthood. Sometimes their children would turn up on the broadcast too if they happened to wander into the dining room at the right time.
Good morning, darling.
Good morning, sweetie.
I hope you noticed Julius's face when he ushered our guests in this morning.
I did. Well, I guess Julius is a movie fan.
And that's not all. He's a baseball fan.
Yes, and it's certainly written all over him today. Well, it's 8:15, and this is Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick, coming as usual, direct from our apartment on 66th Street in New York. And today we're very happy to have at our breakfast table two friends who are also neighbors. And they've strolled up the street for some coffee and eggs with us.
So Dorothy and Richard were seen as a power couple, the couple who had it all. And that included, allegedly, a happy marriage from the outside. And that is what Dorothy and Richard projected to the world, even though that was not the reality and had not been for quite some time. The reality was that Dorothy was the draw, Richard was along for the ride, and as he tried and failed at business venture after business venture, he kept getting more down on himself and creating more tension in the marriage, and Dorothy continued to rise in her career and seize more opportunities. So in 1950, Dorothy was asked to be a regular panelist on What's My Line. Once again, What's My Line was one of the most popular television game shows of early American TV. It was hugely popular, and Dorothy was on it almost every week. The basic concept of the show is simple. They'd bring a mystery guest sometimes, or they would just bring like an ordinary contestant on stage, and then a panel of, I believe, 4 judges would have to ask the mystery guest questions, and the mystery guest would be like shielded, and they try to guess who the mystery guest was, or if it was just a regular contestant, they could see the person, and then they'd ask the person questions about what they did for a living to try and guess what their career was. Dorothy was widely considered the most competitive and analytical panelist in What's My Line history. She approached the game with the same sharp deductive logic she used as a crime reporter. She was really good at guessing incredibly obscure occupations very quickly. She was so good at it, and she had such a high success rate that people accused her of cheating, and they said it was rigged. And even when they weren't accusing her of cheating, they were like, Dorothy Kilgallen takes this show too seriously. Like, she's way too competitive, which I understand. If anybody's played Monopoly with me, then you know how it can be. The show's co-producer, Mark Goodson, has been quoted as saying, quote, Dorothy is a girl of tremendous integrity. If we ever tried to give her the answers, she'd quit the show immediately. Actually, she's the key member of the panel. The show would be a flop if she didn't hold the panel together. End quote. So Dorothy was so valued by What's My Line that she would be seen on the program almost every Sunday night for 15 years. In fact, her last appearance was on November 7th, 1965, where she correctly guessed the occupation of the panelist before being found dead in her apartment the very next morning.
His left is my favorite redhead and yours, Miss Dorothy Kilgallen.
In 1953, Dorothy and Richard purchased a massive 13,000 square foot brick and limestone mansion at 45 East 68th Street. This is the place where the home where Dorothy would be found dead. So it was just a massive kind of townhouse. I know it's like we say townhouse, but I guess that's what it technically is or was, but it's just massive. It's huge. 16 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms. The home was legendary for its opulent interior, which Dorothy decorated with high-end art and unique antiques. In fact, I heard she decorated with some pieces from like Gone with the Wind. I can't remember exactly what. Maybe it was a piano from the movie Gone with the Wind. But she did this because she and Richard would play host to New York's elite during glamorous cocktail parties, and the entire fifth floor of the mansion townhouse was turned into Dorothy's personal sanctuary that she called the Cloop. And the Cloop served as both Dorothy's sleeping quarters and a workspace. Richard, by this time, when they're buying the townhouse mansion, he's not sleeping in the same bedroom as her, not even on the same floor as her. So despite Dorothy's kind of reputation as being fierce and no nonsense and a hard-nosed reporter, the Cloop was decorated in a very like girly, feminine fashion. Chartreuse carpeting, flowered wallpaper, embroidered organdy curtains tied back with elegant taffeta bows. It was funny because most people really wouldn't be allowed into this area. Like Dorothy's hairdresser would kind of be allowed in there sometimes, but for the most part, no one was allowed in the Cloop. And no one really saw how it was decorated, but Dorothy's father, Jim, knew how like girly it was. And he was like, yeah, that's who she was, you know? At her core, she was just like a feminine girl, and she wanted to be like a good journalist, and she wanted to do all of these things and achieve all of these things. But at the end of the day, she was just a girl that wanted to be loved and wanted to be in a good marriage and wanted to be a mother and a wife. And, you know, those things didn't necessarily happen the way she wanted them to. So in the Cloop is where Dorothy would bang away on her typewriter as she wrote her column, often late at night after coming home from What's My Line. So understand, like, Dorothy's got a column to go out every day. She's got What's My Line, like, every night. And then she's got, you know, tea with Dick over here every morning. Breakfast with Dorothy and Richard, or Dorothy and Dick, every morning. So she's doing What's My Line, and then she's coming home writing her column, and then she's got to get up and have breakfast with this guy to keep the whole facade going. And she's doing a lot of things. And she's working on this huge story that she's telling everybody she's about to break, which is the JFK assassination. So on the fifth floor of the Cloop, Richard, the children, the household staff, they were not allowed to enter. And in the final years of her life, Dorothy used the privacy there to compile and pore over her JFK file. But JFK's assassination was not the first time that Dorothy Kilgallen strayed from gossip into politics, nor was it the first time she criticized the United States government and made them look stupid, which is why Dorothy had already been on J. Edgar Hoover's radar long before she started talking about JFK. On July 15th, 1959, Dorothy became the first journalist to suggest publicly that the CIA and the mafia were working together to assassinate Fidel Castro, a pretty big accusation that turned out to be spot on. And like I said, this is widely regarded as the moment she landed on J. Edgar Hoover's radar and prompted the FBI to start a file on her. Now, to understand this in the way we need to understand it, before going any further, we have to talk about Cuba. We kind of have to start at the beginning, so bear with me. This is actually very interesting, and it's important. So America wasn't involved in Cuba until 1898. For centuries, Cuba was a Spanish colony, an incredibly valuable Spanish colony because of its location in the Caribbean and because of its sugar economy. So for centuries, Spain treated Cuba like one of the crown jewels of its empire. And to be fair, from Spain's perspective, Cuba was a crown jewel. It wasn't just rich in sugar, but tobacco, land, ports, and strategic locations. It was basically Spain's very profitable Caribbean cash register. Now, Cuba eventually got tired of Spain for the same reason that anyone gets tired of being controlled by someone who lives very far away, but still insists on taking all your money, making your rules, and acting like they own the place. They technically did own the place, but that's another story. So Spain controlled the government. Spain controlled the trade rules. Spain decided who had power. Spanish officials and also Cuban elites loyal to Spain benefited from the system that was set up, while enslaved people, laborers, farmers, and many of the ordinary Cubans were left living under a structure that worked beautifully for the people at the top and terribly for everyone else. And then as the 1800s went on, the situation became more and more ridiculous and just untenable from the Cuban point of view. Other Latin American countries were breaking away and had already broken away from Spain. Ideas about independence and nationalism were spreading, and people in Cuba were asking very reasonable questions like, why are we still being ruled by a country across the ocean? And why is our island making other people rich while we get told to be grateful for the little that we receive from our own land, from our own country? So Cuba's frustration built over time, and eventually people had enough. In 1868, Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, a Cuban plantation owner, freed the enslaved people on his estate and called for independence. And that began the 10 Years' War. So Cuba didn't win independence right away because Spain was not exactly packing a suitcase and saying, you're right, you make some good points. What are we doing here? Spain fought hard to keep Cuba, hard. But the rebellion lit a fire that kept coming back. So there was another failed uprising and then another. And finally, by the 1890s, Cuba's independence movement had become impossible to ignore, and this is when America entered the picture. So the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, and the explosion killed more than 260 American sailors. The cause was not clear at the time, but the American press and public blamed Spain almost immediately. That gave the U.S. the emotional trigger it needed to go to war. Now, there's a lot going on here, so stay with me. The cause was not clear at the time. It gave the U.S. the emotional trigger it needed to go to war. Nice, convenient way to wrap this up in like the standard narrative, but I don't think it's so simple because before the USS Maine ever exploded in Havana, American newspapers had already been aggressively telling Cuba's story for years. Papers owned by men like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer had covered Spain's war against Cuban independence in the most dramatic possible terms. Starving civilians, brutal soldiers, reconcentration camps, suffering women and children, an old empire refusing to let go of an island that simply wanted to be free. And some of that outrage was real. Spain's tactics in Cuba were brutal. But the newspapers also knew exactly what they were doing. Remember, this was the age of yellow journalism, where horror, scandal, patriotism, and outrage sold papers. So by the time the USS Maine exploded in 1898, the American public had already been trained to see Spain as the monster in the room, which they were. But also remember, I said the exact cause for the USS Maine blowing up was not known at the time. Is it known at this time? Well, officially, the cause of the explosion is still debated. But people have looked into this, and the strongest modern explanation is that it was probably an internal accident, not Spain blowing up the ship. An internal accident that killed American citizens after years of news stories about how bad Spain was and how Cuba needed help breaking free from their horrible regime, providing the exact emotional trigger the U.S. needed to enter the war and help Cuba get rid of Spain for good. I'm not saying Spain wasn't a monster. I'm not saying that Cuba didn't need help. I'm saying that apparently the American public needed something to allow them to accept getting involved in a war that really didn't have anything to do with them. It kind of sounds like Pearl Harbor. Kind of sounds like 9/11, right? Horrible stuff is happening to Cubans at the hands of Spain. We are all morally outraged. And then that one thing happens that affects Americans' lives, and suddenly we are in a war. And you might say, Stephanie, you're being harsh. America wanted to help Cuba. Cuba needed help. You would be correct. But why did America want to help Cuba get rid of Spain? Not the American people, the American government, because we always seem to have a motive and a goal of personal gain when we get involved in these kinds of things. America, the government, the military and stuff that was sent to help Cuba, not exactly a selfless fairy godmother floating in from the north with a wand and a pure heart. Cuba was strategic and great for Spain. So wouldn't Cuba be strategic and great for the United States? Just 90 miles away from Florida, sugar, tobacco, ports, trade, strategic value, and enormous importance in the Caribbean. American businessmen had interest there already. American politicians had been watching the island for decades because they don't want anybody else to go there and build bases that are that close to our coastline in Florida. So when the United States went to war with Spain in 1898, it was partly about outrage, like Spain's bad, partly about sympathy. The Cuban people need our help. And partly about the explosion of the USS Maine, which turns out really wasn't Spain's fault at all, and partly about the very practical reality that America wanted influence in Cuba. The U.S. told the world it was not there to take Cuba. So once they got Spain out, the U.S. was like, we're not going to take Cuba. They deserve their independence. And technically, the United States didn't take Cuba. But after Spain was pushed out, America basically stuck around like an overbearing parent, insisting that Cuba wasn't quite ready to handle things on their own, despite the fact that plenty of Cuban leaders had been planning and fighting for their country's future for decades. So independence came with a helpful list of suggestions, like letting the United States step in whenever it felt necessary, letting the United States set up U.S. naval bases like Guantanamo Bay. America did help Cuba get Spain out of the house, but then America sat down on the couch, put its feet up, and was like, hey, I like it here. I think I'm going to stay. I'm going to hang out, and I'm going to come back whenever I want. The United States said to Cuba, here are your terms and conditions of freedom, which doesn't feel very free. They didn't take Cuba outright, but they kept their hands firmly on the steering wheel. So in the early 20th century, Cuba was deeply tied to United States money. American companies started buying and controlling a lot of the important stuff: sugar, plantations, land, railroads, banks, hotels, utilities, and then later tourism. So even though Cuba had its own government, a lot of the money in Cuba was flowing through American businesses or Cuban elites who worked closely with American businesses. So for many ordinary Cubans, especially workers and rural people, this still meant inequality, poverty, unstable employment, and resentment, both towards local corruption and foreign influence. So by the 1930s, Cuba was unstable. The dictator, Gerardo Machado, was overthrown in 1933, and in that chaos, a young army sergeant named Fulgencio Batista rose to power through the Sergeants' Revolt. Understand that when Fulgencio Batista became the head of the military, it basically meant he was now running Cuba. So whoever the president of Cuba was would have known that Batista was the one who dictated whether he kept or lost that position or lost his life, because whoever controlled the military had the threat of a violent overthrow to hang over the president's head at any time. So if you don't do what I want you to do, if you don't let me do what I want to do, I'll just tell the military to storm your palace, your house, remove you one way or the other, whether we're imprisoning you and putting you on a fake trial or just killing you. And it was right at this time, when Fulgencio Batista was the most powerful man in Cuba, that he began a business relationship with another powerful man, Mayor Lansky. Mayor Lansky was one of the most important organized crime figures of the 20th century, but he wasn't the stereotypical movie gangster kicking down doors with a machine gun. He wasn't like Al Capone, He was more like the mafia's accountant, strategist, also casino consultant. So Lansky was born in what is now Belarus, and his family immigrated to New York when he was a child. He grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and this is where he became close with other young criminals like Lucky Luciano and Bugsy Siegel. So over time, those relationships helped shape what became the modern American organized crime syndicate. But Meyer Lansky's thing was not brute force. His thing was money. He understood gambling, odds, hidden ownership, cash flow, bribery, how to make illegal money look respectable and clean. He was often called the mob's accountant, though that nickname can make him sound like he was just sitting quietly with a calculator wearing a sensible cardigan. In reality, he was helping design the entire financial architecture of organized crime. He was connected to gambling operations in New York, Florida, New Orleans, Las Vegas, and eventually Cuba, because by that time, the 1930s, Cuba had already been a major destination for Americans for decades, not just for business, but for tourism. During Prohibition, especially, Havana, Cuba was attractive because Americans could go there to drink, gamble, party, and escape the harsh U.S. restrictions. It already had the music, the rum, the nightlife, the hotels, casinos, the cabarets, the brothels. And America was like, all right, I mean, if we can't drink here in the United States and it's this big deal, we're just going to go over there and party all the time. It's 90 miles away from the coast of Florida. So Meyer Lansky and Fulgencio Batista made a deal. Batista essentially said, you can run your casinos here, you can build your hotels here, you can bring your American tourists here and make money here. Like I said, there was already all that stuff there. But now the mafia in the United States, the mob, wanted to get involved, get their fingers in the pot. And then Meyer Lansky said essentially, wonderful, we will do that and we'll make sure you and your friends get paid, right? Like you and your supporters, your loyalists, the elite Cubans in your circle. So Batista got cash, investment, glamour, and a Havana that looked like it was booming. Lansky and the mob got protection, casino access, political cover, and a place where gambling could operate openly with very few inconvenient questions and very few, kind of tax issues. So Batista brought the power, Lansky brought the hotel brain, and together they helped turn Havana into a tropical money machine, music and rum in the front, corruption in the back. For Lansky and the mob, Cuba was almost too perfect because gambling could operate openly. And that wasn't the case in America yet. American tourists could arrive there easily. The government was cooperative because it was Batista. The businesses were cash heavy, and behind the roulette wheels and ocean view hotels, money could be skimmed, washed, moved, and made to look clean and respectable. So enter Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano, born Salvatore Luciana in Sicily, became one of the most important architects of modern organized crime in American history. He rose to power in New York during the Prohibition. Before Luciano, organized crime in New York was more old world and chaotic. You had all of these big bosses competing for dominance, street corners, personal loyalty mattered more than efficiency, and disputes would be turning into bodies in the street, causing unneeded attention. So Lucky Luciano looked at that and basically said, what if we stopped killing each other every 5 minutes and we treated crime like a business? Wouldn't it be better for everyone? Luciano helped create a new system. Instead of one man ruling everyone, like a big mafia boss, there would be separate mafia families, right? Like gangs, each with their own territory and leadership. In New York, this became the 5 families. But above all of that, there would be a kind of governing board called the Commission, which is essentially organized crime's board of directors. Major bosses would sit together, settle disputes, approve big decisions, divide territory, and avoid unnecessary wars and violence that would attract police and newspaper attention. So Luciano's genius, evil genius, but still genius, from a productive business perspective, we can admit, his genius was that he made the mafia less emotional and more efficient, right? More cohesive. He also worked closely with non-Sicilian or Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, which was really another move unheard of before this because older mafia figures were often more rigid about ethnicity and tradition. They came from Italy and Sicily. They didn't want to deal with these Irish mobsters or the Jewish ones. But Luciano cared more about usefulness and profit. So if someone could make money, move product, manage gambling, enforce power, or build connections, Luciano wanted them in the orbit. But then he got caught. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was taken down, not for murder, not for bootlegging, which he was doing all of that, but through a prostitution case. So prosecutors accused him of profiting from and controlling a citywide prostitution racket, and he was actually sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, which, according to the Mob Museum, is one of the longest sentences of its kind. And to be fair, Luciano denied a lot of the charges. many witnesses recanted, and it's worth noting that he did get a really long sentence compared to some of his mob peers who were kind of getting in trouble for like other things, like murder and racketeering. I think it's obvious that the U.S. government was threatened by Lucky Luciano. They weren't afraid of him because he was violent, because there was plenty of violent criminals running around. What made Luciano more dangerous was that he helped make crime efficient and more coordinated. Now, you might be surprised to hear that just 10 years into this sentence, Lucky Luciano was released from prison and deported to Italy after receiving a pardon for wartime assistance. What was that wartime assistance? Well, it's called Operation Underworld. You see, the U.S. government has a long history of moral ambiguity when it's convenient. They love a moral red line until someone useful is standing on the other side of it. So Operation Underworld, Operation Paperclip, same difference, same logic. We oppose you morally, but we need you practically. So for now, morality is going to take a little nap, and we'll wake it up when it's convenient for us again. So during World War II, the port of New York was critical to the American war effort, right? Ships, supplies, troops, weapons, fuel, military equipment were moving through those docks constantly. So if enemy saboteurs managed to disrupt the port, the damage could and would be enormous. But the problem for the government was that the waterfront was heavily influenced by organized crime. The mob in New York, they had the waterfront. That was their territory. That was their kind of like stomping grounds. So dock workers, fishermen, union men, truckers, market workers, they were often connected to mob-controlled systems, and they were not exactly rushing to tell federal agents what they knew or what they'd seen. So the government could patrol the harbor, but the mob knew the people, the routines, the back doors, and the quiet conversations. And the government figured, we kind of need them right now. So the Navy and federal prosecutors made contact with mob figures, including Joseph Sachs Lanza, Meyer Lansky, and eventually Lucky Luciano, who was still in prison. So the government wanted intelligence, cooperation, and access. And even from prison, Lucky was still running things. People still respected him. They still listened to him. He's still making calls, sending letters, calling the shots from behind bars. So basically the government was like, hey, tell your people to report suspicious activity to us. Let's minimize any trouble. Let's make sure the docks are secure for the wartime effort, for freedom and the Star-Spangled Banner, and for our national security. So Luciano, who'd been locked away as one of the most dangerous criminals in America with this ridiculous long sentence, suddenly became useful to the American war effort. And after the war, his sentence was commuted. And they were like, one condition, you just got to go back to Italy, right? Because someone like Lucky Luciano can't do any damage from a different country, right? Wrong. Within just months of his return to Italy, Luciano boarded a plane and flew to Havana, Cuba on October 29th, 1946. And about a month later, he convened a historic summit of top U.S. mob bosses at Havana's Hotel Nacional Cuba, which would be known as the Havana Conference. So Lucky Luciano wanted to make it clear that even though he was not in the U.S., he was only 80 miles offshore Florida. He was still powerful. He was still running things. And the conference was a lot of things. It was like to get everyone organized, but it also was a homecoming for Lucky Luciano. So the attendees could go and kiss the ring and pay tribute and invest in the mob casinos that were multiplying in Havana. So at the conference, the future rules of the American National Crime Syndicate were laid out. They also talked about Bugsy Siegel, who apparently had been causing trouble in Vegas at the Flamingo Hotel that he was supposed to be running. I guess he was burning through money. Money was disappearing. Mob investors were becoming very unhappy. The mafia itself was becoming very unhappy. And so they were there to discuss what do we do with Bugsy Siegel. And while we don't know what they said, we do know that Bugsy Siegel was murdered in June of 1947, not long after his fate was being discussed in Havana. The mob bosses also discussed future narcotics operations because obviously casinos weren't enough when Cuba was also the perfect place to help the mob move drugs, specifically heroin, because after World War II, mob-connected networks had access to European and Mediterranean supply routes, and Cuba could serve as a really convenient stopover before drugs moved on toward American port cities. Because America's right there, right? You could see Cuba from Florida on a clear day. I don't know if that's true, but I feel like it is. Maybe it's not. It's probably not, but you know what I mean. It's very close. So when U.S. authorities found out Lucky Luciano was in Cuba, they were nervous. They were like, oh shit, we thought this guy was just going to go to Italy, drink some wine, eat some pasta and chill, but he's back at it. And they actually put pressure on Cuba to get Lucky Luciano out, and that would eventually happen. But at that time, Batista's still in charge, right? And Cuba's like, what do you mean? We like this guy. He's our brother. He makes us money. We love the mob. Also, headlining the Havana conference was Frankie Blue Eyes, good old Frank Sinatra, who we all know was wrapped up in the mob, okay? Like, I don't even need to say allegedly at this point. He wasn't a made man, technically, and he would deny his extensive mob connections until the very end. But there are over 2,000 pages in the FBI vault that would strongly beg to differ. I mean, Lucky Luciano and Bugsy Siegel were in Frank's inner circle. Those were his boys. Frank Sinatra is the person who introduced JFK to Sam Giancana during the 1960 presidential campaign when JFK was, running for president. And this might seem like a fun little history mafia lesson, but it's all connected and important to exactly what we're here to talk about. Because Sam Giancana was the Chicago mob boss. He was kind of tight with JFK. In fact, so tight that they shared a mistress. Her name was Judith Campbell Exner, and she carried communications between JFK and Sam Giancana, communications that included cash and documents that Judith claimed she never looked at, but also she testified that JFK told her they contained intelligence material, the specific intelligence material concerning Cuba. And we'll come back to that, right? Because obviously we know, or we should know, JFK, when he was president, he was like, we gotta get Castro out of Cuba. And there was plots made with, the president and the CIA and the FBI to do that. So Sam Giancana helped get JFK elected president. He struck a deal with JFK's father, Joseph Kennedy. And of course, Joseph Kennedy was like, yeah, help my son get elected. Use your power, use your unions, maybe stuff some ballot boxes, whatever. And I promise in return that when my son is president, his administration is going to go easy on the mafia. Like, we'll look the other way. Ironically enough, when JFK did become president, he appointed his younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General. And RFK proceeded to declare an all-out war on organized crime. Like, he went harder on organized crime than anyone had before, which is the irony of the situation, which is why the mob eventually became mad at JFK. But once again, this is all connected. So let's leave the double-crossing world of Washington, D.C. for a little while and return back to beautiful Cuba. So for a time, organized crime, the mob from the U.S., happily skipped around Havana, living the high life and pocketing millions and millions of dollars. Everyone was happy. Lollipops and cupcakes were falling from the sky. But everyone was, in fact, not happy. Specifically, a young lawyer and political activist named Fidel Castro. Fulgencio Batista had won the Cuban presidential election in 1940. And it's weird because he actually seemed to be like a highly effective and progressive president during that 4-year term. And then 4 years later, he had no problem stepping down peacefully when Ramon Grau San Martin became president. And at first, Ramon Grau seemed to also be doing a good job, I guess. He inherited an economic boom due to soaring global sugar prices. So around the world, sugar is like, oh, everyone wants sugar now, and Cuba's got a lot of sugar. So, the economy is doing all right. And he put a lot of money into schools and Social Security and other good stuff that people said they wanted because he was supposed to be like this freedom fighter and he fought in the revolutions. He was a revolutionary. But then Grau's Minister of Education had to go and ruin it for everyone. He started stealing a bunch of money, doing corrupt things. Ramon Grau kind of looked the other way, maybe benefited a little bit. We don't really know. But during the next presidency of Carlos Prios Acaraz, the corruption continued unchecked. And the people of Cuba were rightly pissed. Not just pissed, they felt completely betrayed because Grau and Prio were supposed to have been revolutionaries. They were the founding fathers and leaders of Cuba's modern revolutionary movement that had overthrown the dictator, Gerardo Machado. So when these two men finally got elected to president, Cubans expected them to be different than the dictators. They were supposed to prove that Cuba could be better and change through elections and constitutions and reform and civil government. They were supposed to show that you didn't need another dictator, another coup, another strongman, another revolution. Instead, the failures of these two men, these two presidents, actually kind of jaded the Cubans. It convinced many Cubans that the whole political system was a fraud, and there was no kind of upright way of running it. Like, all of these politicians are corrupt. Nobody is going to do better for us, no matter what they say, which, like, valid. So back in comes Fulgencio Batista, and he was like, well, I guess I'll overthrow the government again. Someone has to do it. And at that time, he was running for president again. But the early opinion polls were not looking good for him. He was definitely not going to win. I think he was like in third place. So 82 days before the election, Batista was like, well, there's not going to be an election. He took his loyal army officers. He took over the Colombia military camp in Havana, and he was like, these men, talking about the two presidents before him, he was like, they've ruined Cuba. He said they turned Cuba into a playground for gangsters, which is ironic because Batista did that. He said they've been stealing from us, which was true. And now I'm going to step in as the, yes, reluctant hero, because I am a true patriot. I care about this country, and I want to make Cuba better. And apparently our country's on the brink of collapse, and so someone has to do something, and that's going to be me. And the public kind of accepted it. Like, the Cubans were like, all right, Fulgencio Batista was like, democracy, what's that? Fair and free elections? No, we're not doing those anymore. And there was no immediate pushback from anyone because everyone was tired of the corruption and the lies. They had been disenchanted with this, oh, we're going to have a democratic election and we're going to do the right thing. They were like, well, I mean, they're just lying about everything. So maybe democracy isn't the way, I guess. Let Batista do it. Many Cubans initially took a wait and see approach, thinking, well, Batista was a pretty decent president in the 40s. Maybe he really will clean things up. It's better than what we were dealing with recently. But they were catastrophically wrong, because when Batista returned to power in 1952, he was not returning as the same kind of president he'd been in the 1940s. He actually suspended parts of the 1940 Constitution, which had been one of Cuba's proudest political achievements. He restricted political freedoms, specifically for anyone who opposed him or didn't agree with him. He obviously continued to allow and profit from organized crime in Havana. He basically canceled elections in general. In short, he became a dictator. And so then we have Fidel Castro. He's a lawyer. He wants a new Cuba. He'd been planning to run for a House of Representatives in Cuba when Batista threw the Monopoly board on the floor and was like, well, I wasn't going to win this election, so no one's going to even have an election. And Castro was like, oh, this sucks. I wanted to run and get elected. And so he tried to fight Batista legally initially through court petitions. He argued that Batista had violated the Constitution, and Batista was like, what Constitution? I got rid of that. But the courts did not remove Batista from the presidency because, shocking development, dictators who seize power with the army are not usually defeated by paperwork in courts. So Castro began forming his own underground group. At first, it was simply known as the Movement. It was made up of mostly young anti-Batista activists, students, workers, lower middle-class professionals like Fidel Castro, people from Havana's poor neighborhoods. Their first major attempt to take Batista down was the Moncada attack in Santiago de Cuba on July 26, 1953. It was supposed to seize weapons, inspire an uprising, and spark a broader rebellion, but it failed badly. Many rebels were killed, tortured, captured. Castro himself was arrested and put on trial. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but here's the twist. The trial that he was put on, he's allowed to have a trial. That trial was never going to go Castro's way. It was for show, right? So Batista's like, I'm going to show people I'm fair. I'm going to give this guy a trial. It was never going to go his way, but he was allowed to speak for himself and defend himself. And apparently during the court, he gave a moving speech, which is now known as the History Will Absolve Me speech. And then copies of his speech were circulated after the trial by his followers. And Fidel Castro, the revolutionary Robin Hood legend, was born. And the movement continued without him because people were so inspired by his words. And they were like, yes, finally someone gets it. So then in 1955, Fulgencio Batista made the decision to release Castro and others, hoping it would make him look kind and fair because people, like I said, they are mad. They're now kind of pushing back. Strategically, this was a huge mistake because Batista had imprisoned a failed rebel, but he released a revolutionary folk hero with a brand and a pretty large and rabid following. So Castro, he didn't stay in Cuba. He went to Mexico, and there he regrouped, he trained, he gathered people to him, and he got ready for the next attempt to overthrow Batista, right? Fidel Castro wasn't like, well, that didn't work. I guess I'll just go and have a vacation to Mexico. No, he goes to Mexico so he can connect with other people, so he can train, so he can get ready. And it was in Mexico that he connected with another young revolutionary, Che Guevara, originally a doctor from Argentina. Guevara had already seen poverty and inequality in his own country. So when Castro headed back to Cuba, Che Guevara joined him along with Castro's younger brother, Raul, and roughly 82 others. That's it. They had like 82 people in their movement when they went back to Cuba. And they went back to Cuba on a boat, or it was like I don't know, they call it a yacht, but it's a big boat called the Granma. And the landing was a disaster. Castro and his men were attacked. A lot of them were killed. They were scattered into the Sierra Maestra Mountains and widely reported or rumored to be dead by Batista's government, because Batista's government wanted people to believe that Castro and his uprising had been wiped out. Now remember, America is watching what's happening in Cuba very closely. So Herbert Matthews, a respected reporter at the New York Times, he actually went into the mountains where he interviewed Fidel Castro on February 17th, 1957. And this was weird because first of all, Castro knew, like, I don't even have 82 men at this point, right? Because a lot of people got killed when they landed. I have like maybe 25 people, but I need the Americans to think like I have more and this is a legitimate uprising, so they'll get behind me. So he like made it seem like he had, thousands of people behind him hiding in the mountains, but he didn't. But basically, the reporter, he bought the propaganda. So Matthew's 3-part front page series confirmed that Fidel Castro was alive, which meant that Fulgencio Batista was lying. And everyone in America was like, we knew Batista was lying. Like, Castro's alive. We're happy. He also characterized Castro as a dedicated, idealistic reformer and a champion for democracy. He said that Batista was anti-American, but Castro was not. Castro was also definitely not a communist, right? Because that's what Castro told Matthews. So from their mountain stronghold, Castro then began launching guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks on isolated military outposts. He slowly gathered weapons. He strategically also began to cultivate an image as a romantic freedom fighter. Very similar to what Pablo Escobar did in Medellin, winning over the locals by building schools and hospitals, because Castro understood something Batista didn't or couldn't. You do not win a war by only having guns. You need people. You need them to feed you, hide you, guide you, warn you when soldiers are coming, and believe that you are better than the government you're fighting. That is what will win a war. That is what will spark and fuel a movement. So Batista and his soldiers were out there looking for Castro, but they couldn't find them. They would be evaded time and time again because Castro's hiding in the mountains. And in 1958, Batista launched a major military offensive into the mountains, and it got very violent, very bad. Civilians were killed. Suspected rebel sympathizers were tortured or imprisoned. Villages were terrorized. And Batista's repression became one of the biggest reasons more people turned against him. The goal was basically like make helping Fidel Castro so terrifying that nobody dares to do it, but that strategy backfired because brutality pushed people towards the rebels and Castro instead of away from them. So if Batista's soldiers came into a village, beat people, tortured suspects, burned homes, or killed civilians, Castro could say, see, this is exactly why we're fighting. And of course, multiple records and firsthand accounts of what Batista's forces were doing made it back to the U.S. and into the papers. And after that, the rebels started expanding beyond the mountains. Different rebel columns moved west across Cuba. Che Guevara had become Castro's right-hand man by that time. So you have like Fidel Castro was a lawyer, and now he's some like bearded mountain-dwelling rebel. And then you have Che Guevara, who's a doctor, and now he's also like a bearded mountain-dwelling rebel. And he's like his Castro's right-hand man, his biggest lieutenant. So the rebels attacked army posts, they cut roads, they disrupted communications, they continued to make Batista's government look weaker and weaker, and one of the decisive moments came with the Battle of Santa Clara at the end of 1958. Che Guevara's forces helped take the city, and that was a psychological breaking point. So within hours of Santa Clara falling, Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba in the early morning of January 1st, 1959. And then Fidel Castro entered Havana on January 8th, 1959, after leaving the mountains and traveling across the island in this dramatic victory procession. And that night, he spoke at Camp Columbia, the major military base that had once symbolized Batista's power. Because remember, that's the same camp that Batista took over, and he was like, I'm the president now, no more elections. So the speech that Fidel Castro gave that night became famous. It became known as the White Dove speech.
I'll never forget that first speech that he gave. I was watching on television, but they released a flight of doves, a symbol of peace. But one of the doves fluttered up into the air and landed on his shoulder. There was a gasp.
Some people think that the doves had been previously trained to land on Fidel Castro. I don't know how that could be because they were in the mountains. Where did they get the doves from? I'd have to know more. But either way, it's kind of funny, and I can see how it would be moving to people, especially the people of Cuba, after everything they'd been through. And when they're seeing Fidel Castro as like their savior and the person who's going to actually finally make them free and equal and have good lives. So for the first few months of 1959, the United States was like, was basically Fidel Castro was Elvis, okay? Fidel Castro was One Direction. The United States loved him. Major U.S. news outlets and televised programs celebrated the 32-year-old revolutionary. Ed Sullivan actually went to Cuba on January 11th, and he interviewed Fidel Castro. And Sullivan was openly admiring. Some even say he was like fawning over Fidel Castro.
The people of the United States, they have great admiration for you and your men because you are in the real American tradition of a George Washington. We want you to like us, and we like you and Cuba. Fidel, it's been a very great honor to meet you.
Okay.
And your man, I want to...
Very glad, very happy for you, the honor of your interview.
On January 19th, Fidel Castro was on the cover of Life magazine. He was being described as a heroic liberator. In April of 1959, the American Society of Newspaper Editors invited Fidel Castro to tour the United States, and the media covered the visit with intense fascination, right? Like, once again, Fidel Castro is the Beatles. Everything he does is just completely riveting. He had a hot dog at like a zoo, I think, and they were like, this is how he ate the hot dog. He, I would say he kissed babies, and he was just doing the rounds. Like, they were just following him around like, oh, and he looks over his shoulder with a very smoldering gaze. Like, it was ridiculous. And he also, charmed college students at Harvard University where he spoke.
Fidel Castro at the Harvard Law School Forum.
First place, I'm not happy of being so far from you. I used to be near the people.
He went on NBC's Meet the Press, he went on CBS's Face the Nation, and he continued to exert that he was not a communist, and he did not agree with communists.
What is your political philosophy? Are you a communist or a Marxist?
There is not communism or Marxism in our ideas. Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy.
So everyone was pretty much believing the hype, believing that Castro was just the altruistic angel who had saved Cuba, and now everyone would be happy and lollipops and cupcakes would fall from the sky again. Everyone except Dorothy Kilgallen, who was one of the first American journalists to openly question the narrative, like very early on. She was very tongue-in-cheek, very sarcastic, very blunt about it. So on January 21st, 1959, she said, quote, Washington insiders expect Fidel Castro to be invited to visit the White House on the advice of diplomats working on the old theory that if we don't make him love us, he may be wooed by the Russians. Some of the international experts are terribly afraid U.S. press reaction to Castro's executions may have irked him to such an extent that only high-level buttering up could repair the damage, end quote. In fact, Castro did meet with the vice president, who I believe at that time was Nixon, but Dorothy is, she said something about executions, Castro's executions. What are we talking about? Castro's been in the United States. He's kissing babies. He's at the zoo. He's talking at Harvard. He's going on every major, American news television station saying he's not a communist. But in Cuba, there were not good things happening, right? Dorothy was referring to the tribunals and firing squad executions that began in Cuba almost immediately after Castro took power. So his new revolutionary government began rounding up former Batista officials, police officers, allies, people who were not so sold on what Castro was doing. And then they had tribunal trials, which basically means the trial's not held in front of a judge and jury. The trial's held in front of a panel, which in this case, the panel was made up of members of Fidel Castro's revolutionary government. So of course, they are fake trials and they go really fast. And then these people would be executed publicly by firing squad. In fact, 70 men were publicly executed by firing squad on January 12th. Yes, the very day after Ed Sullivan thought about getting a jersey with the name Castro printed on the back of it. This was before Castro's talking to students at Harvard University. This is before Castro's walking around eating a hot dog at the zoo and everyone's fainting Harry Styles just walked in. So Dorothy was like, wait, I thought this was supposed to be the new Cuban Revolution, which had promised democracy and justice and fair and equal treatment. But immediately they're holding public executions. This doesn't sound right. And, Castro was like, well, these were people that were hurting our people and hurting other people before. So that's what they were being put on trial for, their war crimes. But technically, everybody who was being executed, it wasn't just people who had done war crimes. It was any political dissident. So in March, Dorothy wrote, quote, when Fidel Castro isn't engaged in giving interviews for television variety shows in the U.S., he's busy restraining his hot-headed brother Raul from staging mass executions in the Cuban provinces, end quote. She also wrote, quote, Fidel Castro won't shave off his beard for his official visit to Washington. He doesn't dare because nobody would recognize him, end quote. And it's funny because Fidel Castro used to be clean shaven and then he grew a beard and it became kind of his trademark. So in April, Dorothy wrote that U.S. intelligence reports on Castro went back to the 1940s, and they weren't pretty. She said, quote, they listed him as a communist and a killer, end quote. But no, Fidel Castro's not a communist. He said he's not a communist. So Dorothy also said that Castro was a Soviet-aligned danger, meaning there was a danger that Castro and Cuba would fall into the Soviet Union's influence. And Dorothy accused the U.S. State Department of playing ostrich, sticking their heads in the sand and ignoring it, which was dangerous. She was also tracking the mafia's interests in Cuba, noting that American gambling figures and organized crime operators were trying to keep Havana's casinos open under Castro. And she was like, some of them are actually still operating, but it's not exactly what the mafia wants because Fidel Castro is not Batista, and he's not as friendly to the mob and these casinos as Batista was. In fact, Fidel Castro was not friendly to the mob at all. So in a July 1959 column, Dorothy wrote, quote, Fidel Castro is the target for so many assassins. They're apt to fall over each other in their efforts to get him. The mafia want to knock him off, end quote. And this is all pretty impressive because Dorothy was very early in making these predictions. And as it turns out, she was very correct in her predictions. First of all, there was a huge threat of Castro and Cuba being influenced by and allied with the Soviet Union. By December of 1961, Castro gave a televised speech telling the world, quote, I am a Marxist-Leninist and I shall be one until the end of my life, end quote. So what happened here? Fidel Castro said he wasn't a communist, and then he was a communist. So some people feel that Castro was saying the quiet part out loud, that he'd always been a communist and he just lied and presented a different mask to the people of the United States because he was aware of how anti-communist the United States was and how much they feared communism. Some believe that he initially started off more democratic, but as the U.S. and Cuba relations deteriorated, he was pushed into the arms of the Soviet Union, and this kind of evolved his ideals. I would say his ideals were always very socialist. He pretty much nationalized everything. So that happened before he was, in bed with the Soviet Union. Either way, it doesn't really matter because what Fidel Castro would go on to do would be terrible. So even if he started out like, yeah, I want democracy and I want free elections and I want everybody to be happy and lollipops and cupcakes and stuff, that's not what happened. Very, very shortly into his reign of terror, that is not what happened. Because this was followed by Castro aligning Cuba with the Soviet Union, transforming Cuba into a one-party communist state. He then went on to rule as an authoritarian dictator for nearly 5 decades and committed numerous documented human rights abuses. He got rid of free elections. He continued to aggressively suppress and execute political opponents. And in the 1960s, he created forced labor camps to lock up all sorts of people. Political dissidents, yes. But these political dissidents, a lot of times, were artists, university students who expressed different beliefs or nonconformist beliefs, or university students who wanted to listen to Western music, writers, journalists, all sorts of things. These camps were also for religious minorities and members of the LGBTQ community because Castro and Che Guevara found gay men to be incompatible with the macho new communist man. So on May 24th, 1960, Dorothy Kilgallen wrote, quote, "I'm not a political expert or even a political columnist, so I don't expect you to read what I write, Mr. President. I'm just a realistic reporter with some rather good sources. As an example, I would like to point out that when you denounced Fidel Castro for his anti-U.S. policies and thereby made front-page headlines, you were more than 2 years behind my column," end quote. She's saying like, yeah, I said this 2 years ago. So while you guys were kissing his ass, I was like pointing out that it's not looking good and he doesn't have a good history and it's probably not going to go well for us. Dorothy was also right about the mob's interest in Cuba, and she was right about them wanting to take Castro out. And this is crazy to me because the rest of the world wouldn't even get confirmation of this until 1975 during the Church Committee, which was supposed to be investigating the widespread bad behavior of the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. I mean, the American people would find out that such a plot existed at that point, but they didn't even know the details of it until 1990. All right, we're going to talk about that, but Castro overthrows Batista, and then he was like, the casinos are next. The Havana casino world was very offensive to Castro. It represented like opulence and foreign control and corruption and everything that Batista's regime had stood for. So Castro's government shut it down. They shut everything down. They expelled the American mafia presence from Cuba, and the mob was not happy because they lost their tropical cash register. Reportedly, Meyer Lansky lost $7 million himself overnight. So obviously the mafia wanted Cuba back, but they knew in order to get Cuba back, they'd have to get rid of Fidel Castro. And this desire, it actually happened to align perfectly with the desire of the United States government to also get rid of Fidel Castro. So after Cuba joined forces with the Soviet Union, America was like, oh, this is a big problem because Cuba's right there, 90 miles from Florida. And in 1962, U.S. intelligence was coming in saying like, hey, the Soviets are building nuclear missile sites on Cuba. And this would become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And genuinely, it's absolutely accurate to call it a crisis because that shit was scary. That meant Soviet missiles launched from Cuba could reach major American cities and military targets in like minutes. Very, very quickly. Even with early warning systems, the United States would have had very little time to detect the launch, confirm what was happening, alert leadership, make a decision, and respond. And that's what made Cuba different because, yeah, if you're in the Soviet Union and you're launching a missile, that's terrifying, but the distance would give the U.S. at least some warning. They could do something. They could interfere. A missile launched from Cuba, it's game over for America, right? So obviously the U.S. would have liked to see Castro gone and someone in his place who wasn't so cozy and friendly with the Soviet Union and wasn't letting the Soviet Union build missile bases on their island. So the U.S. government and the mafia teamed up to take down Castro in 1960 because the mob wanted him out, the U.S. wanted him out, and they were like, let's work together again. So the CIA recruited high-profile mob bosses and orchestrated plots against Castro. They supplied the mob with poison pills intended for Castro's food and drink. They considered using poisoned cigars. They considered using exploding cigars. They even brought in a commercial wetsuit because Castro was a known diver. Like, he loved diving, like in the ocean and stuff. So they brought in a commercial wetsuit. And they dusted the inside of the wetsuit with a flesh-eating fungus. And then they also contaminated the breathing regulator part with tuberculosis. And then they gave it to some unwitting lawyer who was supposed to be going to Cuba to negotiate the release of some people that were captured during the Bay of Pigs invasion. This unwitting lawyer, they're like, yeah, give this to Fidel Castro as a gift of our cooperation. This poor guy, the unwitting lawyer, he didn't know that this was the plot to kill Castro. So he actually ended up like buying a better wetsuit because he was like, no, this is just a standard wetsuit. Like, what the hell does he want with this? I'm going to buy a personalized, cooler wetsuit for Fidel Castro. And then when the lawyer was there with Fidel Castro, like negotiating the release, he gave him the one he bought. And he didn't give him the one that the CIA had given him to give to Fidel Castro to kill him. So a little funny story. The CIA even had a plan to take a large conch shell and like paint it bright colors and then plant it in the ocean and lure Fidel Castro over while he was diving. And then when he went to like reach for it and he tried to pick it up, it would explode. Obviously, none of these things worked. Fidel Castro went on to live a long life. But how did Dorothy Kilgallen, some female columnist writer in New York who was usually focused on love triangles and what people were wearing to parties, how did she seem to know so much about the mafia? How did she know how they operated, where their financial interests were, what their motives were? Like they're going to want to kill Fidel Castro. They're probably going to, get help to do that. Like, how did she know all of that? Well, Dorothy did have some insight. She'd already gotten into it with Frank Sinatra years before she made these claims about the mafia, wanting to take out Castro because Dorothy and Frank Sinatra had been friendly at one time, but their relationship was forever fractured when she published a multi-part expose called The Real Frank Sinatra Story in February of 1956. And listen, like the relationship was already fractured. It's not like, I'm trying to say this. Dorothy had already been like, all right, this dude's got problems. But Frank Sinatra was like, we're still okay, because he was like oblivious that she had kind of seen who he was and had kind of not liked it and she didn't think he was like a man of morals and that he just kind of like treated people like they're disposable and he hurt people and he wasn't great and he had a temper and all of this stuff. So she was like, I'm not really friendly with him anymore, but Frank Sinatra didn't really know until the expose. And I mean, damn, Dorothy went in on Frank. She talked about his marriage, saying, quote, Frank Sinatra, currently the most valuable problem child in the world of show business, met his match the day he first set his baby blues on Ava Gardner, end quote. And she's like, Ava Gardner's a handful herself. And then she talks about all the women that Frank Sinatra's been with, right? She's like, he's got a long trail of women, scandal, and mess behind him. And she was like, this does not make him something to look at with like respect or admiration. Like he's a mess. He is a mess. He just has sex with women and it doesn't matter who they are or what they look like. Like he's just all over the place. He's all over the place and he's been with a lot of people and it's not, charming and it's not like romantic. It's just kind of messy. She framed Frank Sinatra as volatile, self-involved, self-dramatizing, emotionally messy. And Dorothy didn't just write that Sinatra had been with women. She wrote like she was auditing the emotional wreckage that he had left behind him. But Dorothy was also one of the few mainstream journalists to explicitly name Frank's criminal associates. She repeatedly pointed out his close friendship with Chicago outfit boss Sam Giancana, and she wrote about Sinatra hosting Giancana at the Cal Nava Lodge, a Nevada resort and casino that Sinatra co-owned. And she kind of kept nailing into this, and she's like, hey, how do you guys feel, the other people who own this, that like Sinatra's bringing the mafia to your establishment and now you're seen as like a mafia affiliated establishment. So this eventually contributed to the Nevada Gaming Control Board stripping Sinatra of his gambling license after Giancana was spotted on the property of the resort. So Dorothy used her column to talk about Sinatra playing at the Havana Mafia Conference. And when Sinatra proudly helped campaign for JFK in 1960, Dorothy wrote about how the Kennedys maybe using him now, but they would ultimately distance themselves from Frank Sinatra because his mob ties would become a political liability. Obviously, she was right about all of this. And obviously, Frank Sinatra was furious. He hated her forever. He openly talked about how much he hated her to anyone who would listen, even if it was on a public television show. like he did on Jack Parr. Outside of that, though, Dorothy also did something very interesting. When Fidel Castro took over Cuba in 1959, she traveled to Miami, Florida, and she talked to a bunch of Cuban exiles, people who had fled Cuba, people who opposed Castro, people who believed very early that the revolution was not the democratic liberation story much of the American press wanted it to be. A lot of people, when they started seeing the public executions, even if they'd been for Castro before, they were like, no, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I asked for. Like, it's just more of the same. So they left. They realized that, it was time to go, and they went to Florida. That's why there's a huge Cuban population in Miami, by the way. Shout out to them. I have friends in Miami who are Cuban and who I talked to when I was trying to go over this history and make sure I had like the Cuban perception correct. And shout out to all the Cubans in Miami. We love you. So Dorothy had the inside track because she was talking to people who'd been in Cuba, who had seen things, who had firsthand knowledge. And once again, while the seasoned reporters in the media were falling all over themselves to talk to Castro, Dorothy was moving quietly behind the scenes, talking to the people who were affected by Castro, who were telling the true story about what was happening in Cuba, not the polished, I'm not a communist story that Fidel Castro wanted people to believe. So Dorothy was not just a gossip columnist who accidentally wandered into politics. She knew how to do the work. She knew how to gather background, read between the lines, and notice when the public story didn't match what people were whispering behind closed doors, which is exactly why she saw what happened to JFK, and she was like, something's off here. So by the late 50s and early 1960s, Dorothy had already been brushing up against some of the most dangerous intersections in American life: organized crime, Fidel Castro, the mafia, American intelligence, political power. She's calling out the American government, making them kind of look stupid. Like, why is the State Department ignoring what's very clear here? Why is the State Department and why is America like fawning over this guy? She's making them look stupid. She's printing the truth, and they don't want people to know the truth, right? So she also was aware at that point of the uncomfortable reality that governments sometimes work with the very people they publicly condemn to take out political figures that become problematic. She understood that public enemies could become private partners when power, money, and national security were involved. So when President Kennedy was killed in 1963, Dorothy was not starting from zero. She already understood how quickly official stories could be polished for public consumption while something much more complicated and true was moving underneath. So when Lee Harvey Oswald was presented as this lone gunman, Dorothy didn't simply accept it and move on. Something about the official story bothered her. And unlike most people, Dorothy had the instincts, the sources, the nerve, maybe some people would say the ego, because she stupidly thought she could kind of like, once again, shout all this stuff out and nothing would happen to her. But she had what it took to start pulling at the threads. She began asking questions. She began talking to people. She began building a file. And according to accounts of her final months, that file, the work she was doing, the notes she was gathering, the material she believed mattered, would vanish by the time her body was found. So that was a lot for today. We have all the foundation laid. We have all the background. It is the perfect place to now launch into Dorothy actually, knowing and meeting JFK. Dorothy finding the whole lone gunman thing to be absolutely ridiculous. Dorothy talking to Jack Ruby, being the only one who was allowed to have an interview with Jack Ruby, the person who killed Oswald. Dorothy talking to mafia figures, realizing that the mafia was connected, realizing the U.S. government was connected and intertwined. Dorothy able to get transcripts from a committee that was put together to investigate what happened to JFK. But really what was going on in the committee was being hid, and she was able to get transcripts and talk about what was in them. And then at that point, the FBI, the CIA, everyone's kind of not happy with her and they're kind of on her. So it's like, who killed Dorothy Kilgallen? Because the official narrative is going to be that it was an accidental overdose, but there's a million reasons of why that isn't true. There's a ton of evidence of why that doesn't make any sense. I guess that there's no doubt in my mind that this was a setup, that Dorothy was killed because of what she was talking about, what she was going to report. But who did it? Was it the government? Was it the mafia? I don't know. I think I have some suspicions, and I have some definite kind of information that's going to point one way more than the other, but we will talk about all of that next time. Let me know what you thought about this video. I know it was a lot of background. I know it was a lot of history. I love this stuff. and I know that you guys do too usually, but let me know what you thought about this one. Like the video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you very, very soon for part 2. Thank you so much. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly, and so you got to let it go. I got blood.